I was born into a house where silence was a virtue and comparison was currency. My name is Lena Hayes, and by the time I was 10 years old, I understood that in my family, love was conditional and hierarchy was inherited, not earned. My older sister Melissa was the sun around which our household revolved while I existed somewhere in the orbit of shadows. Melissa was 3 years older, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, effortlessly charming, and seemingly incapable of doing wrong in the eyes of our parents. From an early age, it was clear that she was the investment they had chosen to nurture while I was expected to survive on the leftovers of their attention. I remember once coming home with a certificate for winning a statewide art contest. I was 9. I had worked on that piece for weeks, using broken crayons and old watercolors I'd collected from my elementary school's discard bin. I'd never seen my teacher beam the way she did when she handed me the award. I thought maybe this time they'll see me. I rushed home, the certificate trembling in my small hands, only to find my mother preoccupied with hemming Melissa's cheerleading uniform. "That's nice, sweetie," she said without even looking up. "Just leave it on the counter." Melissa was getting ready for a big pep rally and Dad was trying to fix her stereo so she could practice her routine. My victory was a passing breeze in the hurricane of Melissa's spotlight. That was the first time I realized being good wasn't enough. I had to be necessary to be noticed. Over time, I became what they praised me for: quiet, obedient, low maintenance. When I needed school supplies, I learned to wait for the discount bins. When I wanted to join a club, I picked the ones that didn't require fees. My parents always told me I was so independent with an admiring tone that masked their relief at not having to do more. At first, I clung to their crumbs like they were currency. Then I grew resentful. Melissa flunked out of college twice, and each time, Mom and Dad smoothed things over with tuition payments and new apartments. When she failed again, they still rewarded her with a brand new Honda and said she's just finding herself. When I applied to a university out of state on a partial scholarship, they told me I should stay close. "Melissa is going through a rough time," Mom had said. "You're stronger. We need someone dependable at home." It wasn't a request. It was a command disguised as guilt. I deferred the scholarship, took night classes at the local community college, and worked full-time as a cashier during the day. When I tried to protest, Dad simply said, "Family comes first. Your sister needs support right now. She's the one who struggles." That became the family motto. Melissa struggles, Lena survives. Even our childhood bedrooms told the story. Hers was a floral fantasy with pastel walls, vanity mirrors, and expensive curtains. Mine was a corner room with mismatched furniture and boxes of old textbooks no one wanted. I decorated it with thrift store art and pinned sketches I made during breaks between shifts. My rebellion wasn't loud. It was quiet, calculated, buried beneath layers of resignation. But one person saw me. My grandfather Arthur, my mom's father. He lived 5 miles away in a modest brick house and had a stubborn habit of treating me like I mattered. When I was little, he'd let me help him sort mail and write birthday cards. As I got older, he taught me how to use his old typewriter and later gifted me a used laptop so I could pursue my interest in digital design. While my parents discouraged my dreams as impractical, Grandpa Arthur encouraged them like they were sacred. "You see things others miss," he said once, tapping a finger to the side of his head. "That's not a flaw, Lena. That's your strength." I clung to those words like oxygen. He became my refuge. Every Saturday I visited him sometimes just to sit in silence. He didn't ask me to shrink. He didn't tell me to be more like Melissa. He asked what I wanted to be, and then he listened. When I was 21, my grandfather fell ill. Stage 4, prostate cancer. I moved in to care for him during his final years balancing work school and the slow heartbreak of watching the one person who truly saw me fade away. Melissa visited once every few months, always dressed impeccably, always managing to make his dying days about her. "It's so depressing here," she'd whisper as if I weren't in the room. When he passed, I was the one holding his hand. Not because I was chosen, but because no one else came. At the funeral, Melissa cried loudest. Mom clutched her like she had lost her own heart while I stood beside the casket trying to remember the last thing I'd said to him. "I love you," I had whispered. "You gave me everything I never got from them." But no one asked what Grandpa gave me. No one cared about the girl who held the oxygen mask, cleaned the IV drips, paid bills with tips from her shift at the diner. They only saw Melissa in her black lace dress and teary blue eyes. I returned home that night and stared at the old sketchbook he'd given me when I turned 13. Inside, I found a note. Never forget your worth, even when they try to sell you short. It didn't feel prophetic then. It just felt kind. I would not realize until much later how much he meant it. When his will was being finalized, I was barely informed. Melissa called once vaguely mentioning a reading at the family lawyer's office. It's mostly formalities, she said. Don't expect much. Grandpa didn't have that much to give. I didn't argue. I didn't ask. I was used to being written out of stories, but what I didn't know then was that this particular story wasn't over. It was just waiting for the right moment to turn. And when it did, it would rip open every wound they thought I had learned to hide. And I wouldn't hide them anymore. I would use them. I would build something from the ashes they left me in. And this time, they would have no power to silence me. Melissa was the family jewel, the one everyone noticed when she walked into a room. She had a glow that seemed effortless, a way of flipping her hair and laughing just loud enough to command attention without appearing to try. When we were younger, people used to say we were both pretty, but Melissa's going to be a star. That kind of praise doesn't just shape the one who receives it, it scars the one standing beside them. While Melissa moved from piano to ballet to debate team to modeling camp, I learned to make space. I learned to clap the loudest when she won and disappear when she failed so I wouldn't make it worse. Even as kids, she knew how to manipulate our parents with her tears, her tantrums, her carefully timed breakdowns that somehow always coincided with moments I might have earned a sliver of praise. When I got straight A's, Melissa cried because her English teacher had criticized her essay. Mom told me not to show off my report card at dinner, it would only make my sister feel worse. I began to hide my achievements like secrets, unsure whether pride was even allowed for someone like me. By the time Melissa was 17, she'd perfected the art of performance. To the outside world, she was charismatic and magnetic. At home, she wielded power like a knife sharp and always at the ready. I remember once coming home late from work, exhausted after a double shift. Melissa had taken my favorite sweater without asking and spilled wine on it. When I confronted her, she burst into tears so dramatic you'd think I'd hit her. My parents came running. I was scolded for starting a fight. Melissa sniffled from behind them, whispering, "I just wanted to look nice for my date." That night, I slept on the floor because she had borrowed my room for the evening. When I tried to speak up the next morning, Dad slammed his mug down and told me to stop causing drama in this house. Every time she hurt me, it became my fault for reacting. That was Melissa's genius. She could burn the house down and convince everyone the smoke was my doing. Over the years, this pattern calcified into something unbreakable. Melissa dropped out of college and moved home. Instead of consequences, she got a condo downtown fully paid by my parents as a fresh start. I got silence when I told them I was struggling to pay for textbooks. Melissa maxed out 3 credit cards shopping online, and Mom called the banks to negotiate on her behalf. I called home asking for help covering a medical bill once and was told to tighten my budget. The message was always the same: Melissa needs help. You're fine, but I wasn't fine. I was shrinking. I was learning to disappear so well that sometimes even I forgot what I wanted. I convinced myself that needing nothing was a kind of power, but deep down it was just the armor I wore because I knew no one was coming to save me. When Grandpa Arthur fell ill, Melissa posted filtered selfies with him on Instagram every few months, writing captions about cherishing every moment. But she only visited when there was a camera involved. I was the one changing his sheets, emptying bedpans, learning how to adjust his oxygen tank. At night, I sat by his bedside while he faded in and out of sleep, whispering stories of his youth, of my grandmother, of the life he built. He told me things he never told anyone else, things I'll never forget. And yet, at his funeral, Melissa took the podium and performed like she'd been his primary caretaker. She cried, voice trembling, then turned to the audience and said, "My grandpa always said I had his spirit. He believed in me." I sat in the second row, hands clenched, heart hammering, watching as Mom dabbed her tears with a tissue and squeezed Melissa's hand. No one looked at me. No one asked if I wanted to say something. I told myself it didn't matter. That grief was private and real, even when unacknowledged. but deep down, I felt the betrayal like a bruise. After the service, Melissa posed for photos with family friends, makeup perfect, smile wide. When I walked past her to leave, she didn't even glance up. Later that week, she called. Her voice was light casual. "Hey, just so you know, there's going to be a will reading. Grandpa left most stuff to the family trust, but you should be there. For formality." I asked when and where. She gave me the time and address, then added, "Don't be disappointed. Grandpa didn't have much left." I thanked her and hung up, feeling something sour twist in my stomach. She was lying. I didn't know how I knew, but I did. Grandpa had always been meticulous. He paid off his house. He had bonds investments, a vintage book collection. He told me about them. He even asked my opinion about who to contact if something happened. He had plans. Melissa didn't know half of what he owned, but she was confident. Too confident. I suspected then, before it all began, that she had her hands on something she wasn't meant to. I just didn't realize how far it had gone until the day I stepped into the lawyer's office and saw the smug curve of her lips. I should have known the war wasn't over. I should have known Melissa never made a move without strategy, but I had one advantage she didn't count on. Grandpa had never underestimated me, and neither would the person he trusted with the truth. Not for much longer. The day Grandpa Arthur died, the house felt colder than I'd ever known. I had been living with him for nearly 2 years by then, balancing freelance design work and online classes while taking care of his declining health. The hospice nurse had just left when his breathing changed, becoming shallow and irregular. I sat beside him holding his frail hand, whispering that he wasn't alone, that I was there. He passed quietly without drama, just a soft exhale into stillness. I didn't cry at first. I just sat there, stunned by the weight of the silence that followed. When I called my mother, her response was stiff. She said she and Dad would arrange the funeral and Melissa would help. No one asked if I was okay. No one asked if I needed anything. Instead, I was told that since I'd already done so much, I should step back and let the family handle the arrangements. That was how they said thank you. They took his body and pushed me aside. I wasn't consulted on the obituary. I wasn't asked what songs he loved or who he wanted to deliver the eulogy. The service was scheduled at a venue I knew Grandpa didn't care for, a modern cold space with glass walls and minimalist pews. I showed up anyway, dressed in black, wearing the tie clip he'd once given me, though it belonged to my father's generation. I sat quietly in the second row behind Melissa, who was dressed in designer morning wear and dabbing her eyes dramatically before any words had been spoken. Mom leaned into her side. Dad adjusted her coat. They looked like the picture of grief. I looked like a stranger at a stranger's memorial. When Melissa stood to speak, I braced myself. She began with a story I'd never heard before, something about him taking her fishing, which I knew for a fact never happened. She spoke in that airy, performative tone she used when she was crafting an audience. She called him her mentor, her rock, her inspiration. My fingers dug into the hem of my dress as I listened to her rewrite history with eloquent lies. After the service, family and guests mingled over lukewarm coffee and catered sandwiches. Melissa held court near the front doors, accepting condolences like a widow accepting blessings. When I approached to thank a neighbor for coming, Melissa placed a hand on my arm and said through gritted teeth, "Don't cause a scene today. He loved us both." I stared at her speechless. I hadn't spoken a word, and already I was a threat to her narrative. I stepped away and stood outside under the gray sky, wind biting my cheeks, wondering how grief could feel like both emptiness and fury. The days that followed were a blur. I returned to Grandpa's house, now lifeless and hollow, to collect my things. The furniture had already been tagged with sticky notes, blue for Melissa, yellow for Mom, green for donation. None of them were mine. Even the chair he used to sit in during our nightly talks was marked blue. There was no mention of a will, no copy, no contact from his lawyer. When I asked my mother, she said Grandpa had kept everything simple, that he trusted the family to do the right thing. The words sounded rehearsed. Melissa called 3 days later to confirm the reading date. "Don't be late," she said, as if I were a forgetful child. "There's not much to go around anyway." I didn't sleep the night before the reading. I lay awake replaying every memory I had of Grandpa, every lesson, every time he told me to believe in myself even when no one else did. He once told me, "There will come a day when you'll have to stand up for your own truth. Don't wait for permission." At the time, I thought he meant something metaphorical. I didn't know it would become literal. As I walked into the lawyer's office the next morning, my stomach twisted into knots. The waiting area was small and tastefully furnished. Melissa sat confidently in a navy blazer and heels that probably cost more than my rent. My parents sat beside her dad scrolling through his phone, Mom whispering something to Melissa with a smirk. When they saw me, no one stood. No one smiled. The attorney, Mr. Rollins, greeted me with a polite nod and gestured us into a private conference room. On the table sat a single brown folder and a sealed envelope. The air felt thick. Melissa looked bored. I felt like I was walking into a trap. I just didn't know yet how deep the bait ran. The conference room smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper, like a place where secrets were stored more often than shared. I took the seat furthest from Melissa, ignoring the way she glanced at me like I didn't belong. Mr. Rollins adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and opened the folder. As executor of Arthur Hayes's estate, he began, "I'm here to read the final wishes he left in his documented will." His tone was professional steady, but there was something unreadable in his expression, something that hinted not everything was as it seemed. Melissa leaned forward slightly, already poised to receive. My parents sat upright, hands clasped on the table, calm and expectant. I folded my hands in my lap, grounding myself against the familiar feeling of exclusion. Mr. Rollins continued listing off a few charitable donations, small sums to organizations Grandpa had long supported. Then he reached the section about family. Melissa was named first. She was to receive Grandpa's sentimental collection, a vague description that made my father nod and Melissa beam. She looked at me triumphant, already assuming she'd won. In regard to Lena Hayes, Mr. Rollins said next, "Arthur Hayes has left $2. For a moment, I thought I misheard. The room went still too still. Melissa let out a soft, almost pitying laugh. My mother gasped. My father looked at me like I had just been told a punishment I'd earned. "There must be a mistake," I said, my voice calm flat, as if removed from my own body. Mr. Rollins looked down at the paper again. He left a written note stating it was to be symbolic, he said carefully. "A token amount." Melissa leaned back in her chair, her smirk expanding like a shadow. "Well, that's what you get for always isolating yourself," she said under her breath, loud enough for only me to hear. I could feel the heat rise behind my eyes, but I swallowed it. The humiliation wasn't just in the amount, it was in the message. It was a public declaration that I mattered so little I wasn't even worth explanation. My parents didn't speak. They didn't look at me. I stood up, heart-pounding fists clenched. If that's everything I said, barely holding my voice together, I'll see myself out. But before I could turn, Mr. Rollins raised a hand. "Actually, Miss Hayes, there's one more item," he said. "It was delivered separately from the will. Your grandfather left this for you specifically." He reached beneath the desk and retrieved a sealed envelope, thick and weighty, with my name written in familiar handwriting across the front. The sight of it punched the air from my lungs. Melissa froze. My mother shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Rollins extended the envelope toward me with both hands. He instructed that I deliver this to you personally, privately if necessary. I stared at it for a moment before taking it, my fingers trembling. As I opened it, the only sound in the room was the soft rip of the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter and a second document. Another, will this one notarized, signed, dated more recently than the one just read. My eyes scanned the lines, and I felt the floor of my world shift beneath me. The second will left everything, the house, the accounts, the investment portfolio, even the vintage collection Melissa so smugly assumed hers to me. Every last piece. "What is that?" Melissa demanded. "What is she holding?" I looked up at Mr. Rollins. He nodded solemnly. "A legally binding revision, executed 3 months before Mr. Hayes's passing. It supersedes the earlier version. He requested it be kept separate until the initial reading." The color drained from Melissa's face. My mother gasped again, but this time it was a different sound, shock, not pity. I folded the letter and will carefully slid them back into the envelope and met their eyes for the first time without fear. The room no longer belonged to them. It belonged to me. For the first time in my life, silence worked in my favor. The stunned expressions on Melissa's face on my parents' faces were louder than any apology they'd never given. I held the envelope gently in my hands as if it contained not only Grandpa's words, but the proof that I had never been crazy, never been wrong, never been invisible. Mr. Rollins cleared his throat, breaking the quiet. "I'll begin the process of transferring the estate immediately," he said calmly. "Miss Hayes, I'll need you to come by later this week to go over the details." I nodded, not taking my eyes off my sister, whose mouth opened, then opened again, as if forming words had suddenly become an impossible task. "This isn't fair," she finally hissed. "He wouldn't have done this. She manipulated him. She turned him against us." My father stood up sharply, voice raised. "There's no way Arthur would give everything to Lena and leave you with nothing, Melissa. She must have—" "Don't," I said, my voice low but firm, slicing clean through the outrage. "Don't rewrite this like you've rewritten everything else." I turned to Mr. Rollins. "Thank you. I'll see you Friday." I walked out without another word, without looking back, not because I didn't want to see their reactions, but because I didn't need to. The weight I carried for years had shifted. It wasn't gone, but it was no longer mine alone to bear. Grandpa had seen everything. He had planned for everything. And now, the silence, the dismissal, the years of being told to lower my voice and expectations had finally been answered. The next few days were a strange blend of numbness and clarity. I stayed at a motel near my old neighborhood while I waited for the estate transfer paperwork. The keys to Grandpa's house would be mine again soon. The house I had once shared with him, the place where I had known peace for brief moments amid the chaos of family obligation. Melissa called me 3 times. I didn't answer. She sent a long, rambling text blaming me for humiliating her, accusing me of twisting Grandpa's affections, of being selfish, of being cruel. She ended with, "I hope you're happy," which made me laugh for the first time in days. My mother sent a shorter message. "We're shocked. Your sister is heartbroken. I hope you'll reconsider and share." I didn't respond. They hadn't asked how I felt. They only asked what they could still take. I met with Mr. Rollins on Friday. The paperwork was thorough and well prepared. He handed me a set of keys, a folder of property documents, and a final envelope. "He wanted you to have this last," Mr. Rollins said. Inside was a check made out to me for a significant sum, more than I'd ever seen at once in my life, and a note in Grandpa's familiar handwriting. "Use this to build, not escape. I believe in what you can become. Don't let their voices drown out your own anymore. You were always meant to lead." I stared at that sentence for a long time. It wasn't just inheritance. It was affirmation. It was the first brick in a foundation I never thought I'd be allowed to build. I used part of the money to pay off my student loans and finish the design certification I had once given up. I invested the rest, carefully seeking out a business mentor through a professional women's network. I rented a small studio and began working on my own branding firm quietly, methodically, with the kind of discipline that came naturally to someone used to doing everything alone. Over the next 18 months, I built my client list from nothing. I worked through weekends, turned down social invites, refined my voice and style until my designs spoke louder than any pitch. I didn't talk to my family during that time. I didn't need to. My name began to circulate in niche marketing circles. My website was featured in a design magazine. Then came the turning point, an opportunity to rebrand a fast-growing wellness company. The campaign went viral. I was hired full-time as creative director with stock options and remote flexibility. I moved into a new apartment, modern, warm, full of light and quiet. The kind of place that felt like mine from the moment I stepped inside. The kind of place no one could walk into and tell me to leave. One afternoon, nearly 2 years after the will reading, I received an invitation in the mail. Melissa was hosting a charity gala under the Arthur Hayes Foundation name. My name was on the donor list, though I had never contributed. There was a note scribbled on the back. "It would mean a lot if you came. Everyone's asking about you." I almost laughed. I hadn't been anyone in their eyes when I scrubbed Grandpa's bathroom floors, but now that my name carried weight, they remembered me. Still, curiosity tugged at me. I RSVP'd, yes, not to be cruel, not to show off, but to look them in the eye and let them see that I had never needed their approval to rise. Only the chance. When I arrived at the gala, Melissa was near the entrance greeting guests. She froze when she saw me. I was dressed simply black jumpsuit hair, up no diamond necklace, no dramatic entrance. Just me, calm, collected, unmoved. She smiled tightly. "You look different." "I am," I said. She cleared her throat. "I didn't know if you'd come. You invited me. I thought maybe you'd want to see what I've been doing." "I started this in his name." "His name," I repeated. "The one you tried to erase from me." Her expression faltered. "Lena, I know we've had differences, but—" "You gave me $2, I said, voice low. "That wasn't a difference. That was a declaration." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. I nodded once and walked past her into the room filled with people who knew me not as her sister, but as Lena Hayes, founder-designer survivor. My story wasn't theirs to rewrite anymore. It was mine. The gala was held in a rented event hall downtown, the kind with crystal chandeliers and long tables draped in ivory linen. Waiters floated through the crowd with trays of champagne and bruschetta, and a string quartet played soft classical music from a raised platform in the corner. People milled about, mingling, networking, donating. My grandfather's name was on every banner, every brochure, and even projected in soft gold lettering across one of the walls. It was strange seeing his legacy turned into branding, especially by the same people who had once minimized his final years, but I stayed quiet, observing. I walked past displays of photos Melissa with Grandpa as a child. Melissa receiving an award, Melissa posing beside him during holidays. My name didn't appear once, not in the photos, not in the speeches. It was as if I had never existed in his story, or at least not in the version curated for public sympathy and donations. But that didn't bother me as much as it once might have, because the people who mattered knew. My clients knew. My team knew. And I knew. That was enough. I made my way to the bar and ordered a sparkling water. As I stood sipping from the glass, a tall man in a tailored suit approached me with a warm smile. He introduced himself as an investor from one of the firms that had backed Melissa's foundation. He told me he'd heard of my design firm, mentioned how much he'd admired the Sunrise campaign I'd led the year before. We spoke for 10 minutes about creative strategy, market trends, and leadership, and not once did he mention Melissa. Not once did he ask how we were related. That conversation reminded me of the starkest truth I had learned through all this, that once I stepped away from the family that refused to see me, the world outside had plenty of people who did. A few minutes later, Melissa approached again, this time with less polish. She looked tired beneath the makeup, her heels slightly scuffed, her voice thinner. "You know," she said, trying to sound casual, "some of the donors were surprised you were here. I didn't expect them to recognize you like that." "They know me for what I've built," I replied. "Not for who I'm related to." "I didn't mean anything by it," she added quickly. Things changed so fast. I didn't think you'd become this." I looked at her carefully, searching for sincerity. For once her eyes didn't hold that same edge. They looked restless, maybe even regretful. But it wasn't enough. Not after everything. "You thought I'd always stay behind you," I said plainly. "That's what everyone in our family expected." "I didn't mean it that way," she whispered, but the truth lingered in the air between us. I turned back to the bar and took another sip. She stood beside me for a moment longer, then said, "Mom's been asking about you. Dad, too. They're wondering if you'd come by sometime." "They're not wondering about me," I said without bitterness. "They're wondering what part of me they can still control." Her expression twisted, but she didn't deny it. "They miss you. They miss the version of me that kept quiet and stayed small. That version doesn't exist anymore." I could see the weight of those words land on her. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then finally said, "You know I told them you'd probably never forgive us." "I haven't," I replied, calm and unwavering. "But I've moved on. That's more powerful than forgiveness. It means I don't need anything from you anymore." "Then why are you here?" she asked softly. "Because I wanted to see for myself. And because Grandpa's name deserves to be honored even if the story you tell about him isn't the whole truth." She looked down at her hands, fingers twisting a napkin into a knot. "You were always his favorite. she said, almost like an accusation. No, I said. I was just the only one who listened when he spoke. I turned and left her there, surrounded by people she was trying to impress, wearing a dress that fit her perfectly but couldn't cover the cracks forming beneath. I made my way to the elevator and pressed the button relieved when the doors slid open immediately. As they closed, I caught a glimpse of Melissa standing alone, back stiff, watching me leave. In that moment, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free. When I stepped into the cool night air, the sky above was velvet black and scattered with stars. I walked to my car, slowly letting the quiet settle around me like a familiar friend. There was nothing else to prove, nothing left to win. I had already done what they never thought I could. I had claimed my own story, built a life outside of their expectations, and stood tall without their permission. I drove home to a place I owned with walls I had painted myself and a name on the mailbox that finally felt like it belonged. Hayes. Not because of them, but in spite of them. The weeks following the gala passed with a stillness that felt unfamiliar. No texts from Melissa, no emails from my parents, no unexpected knocks on my door. Just silence. For someone who had once been defined by the noise of other people's expectations, I found peace in the absence of their voices. I threw myself into my work. My company, Solace Creative, had just signed 2 major clients in healthcare and sustainability, and I was overseeing a team of designers who respected not only my vision but my leadership. We held weekly creative briefings on the rooftop garden of our shared workspace, a tradition I'd started to replace the sterile conference room vibe I had loathed in my early jobs. There, among potted herbs and the sound of wind chimes, I found myself giving advice I'd once needed, reminding younger creatives to protect their ideas, to know their worth, to demand fair pay, to walk away from tables where they were asked to shrink. I thought often of Grandpa's final note, use this to build, not escape, and that's what I had done. Every inch of my company, every contract negotiated, every intern hired felt like a brick in the foundation of the life he believed I could create. One afternoon, as I finalized a pitch deck for a new fintech startup, an email arrived from Mr. Rollins. The subject line was simple: update regarding foundation disbursement. I opened it with mild curiosity, expecting some administrative notice about the estate, but the contents made me pause. He informed me that my grandfather had left a clause buried within a side trust that would activate exactly 2 years after his passing. The clause instructed that a final letter be sent, one for me, one for Melissa, and one for my parents. Mr. Rollins attached my letter digitally and noted that the others had been mailed earlier that week. I hesitated, then opened the PDF. My grandfather's handwriting, scanned and steady, greeted me on the screen. Lena, I knew you'd get here. I knew you'd build something worthy, and I want you to know how proud I am. Not because of your success, but because you didn't let them erase you. I saw every moment they made you feel small. I kept quiet more than I should have, and for that I'm sorry. But I never stopped believing that one day you'd stand taller than all their expectations. You were never the quiet one, not really. You were just the one they tried to silence. And now you've proven that your voice is not only strong, it's needed. Keep using it. The world needs what you have to say. Love, always, Grandpa. I read it 3 times before closing my laptop, eyes burning not from pain, but from a sense of closure I hadn't realized I was still seeking. It wasn't about the money. It had never been. It was about being seen. A few days later, Melissa called. I let it go to voicemail, then listened. Her tone was different this time. Not defensive, not angry, just tired. I got his letter, she said. I guess I forgot he saw everything too. I don't know what to say. Maybe I never will. But I wanted you to know. I'm not going to fight for any more. Not the house, not the foundation name, not the accounts. You earned it. I just hope someday we can talk not about the past, but something else. I don't know what. She hung up. I didn't call back. Not out of spite, but because she was right, we had nothing else to say right now. The past was an anchor I had finally released, and I had no desire to go diving for it again. Instead, I turned my focus forward. I applied for a professional development grant to expand Solace Creative's mentorship program. I began mentoring 2 young designers from underrepresented communities. I even submitted an article to a major business journal about building creative leadership from trauma. It was published within a month, The title, The Power of Not Being Chosen. One morning, as I walked into the office early, coffee in one hand and my sketch pad in the other, I passed the portrait of Grandpa Arthur I'd hung in our common room. It was a photo I had taken years ago. He was in his garden laughing at something I'd said sunlight catching the silver in his hair. Below it, I'd added a brass plaque for the man who saw me before I saw myself. That day, one of our interns asked who he was. I smiled and replied, "The reason this place exists." She nodded, then returned to her desk. No further questions, no complicated explanations. Just truth resting quietly in the room. And in that moment, I felt it again. Not vindication, not triumph, but peace. The kind that comes not from winning a war, but from walking away from the battlefield and choosing to plant something instead. Something real. Something lasting. Something mine. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon when I received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Just my name written in slanted handwriting that I hadn't seen in over a year. I recognized it immediately. It was my mother's. I stood in the kitchen with the unopened letter in one hand and a mug of tea in the other, staring at it like it might explode. I hadn't heard from either of my parents since Melissa's last voicemail months ago. There had been no calls on my birthday, no acknowledgments of the article that had gone mildly viral, no attempts to reconnect. Just silence. Until now. I didn't open the letter right away. I set it on the counter beside the fruit bowl and went about my day finishing a pitch draft, watering the balcony plants, even cleaning out the junk drawer in the hallway. Anything to delay the pull of that envelope. But that night, as the wind tapped softly against the windows and my apartment lay in quiet calm, I sat on the couch and opened it. The letter was short. "Lena, we received Grandpa's letter. Your father hasn't spoken much since. I think we both assumed things about him about you that were easier than facing the truth. I won't pretend we didn't hurt you. I see now how deep the damage went. I don't expect you to forgive us, and I won't ask you to. But I do hope you're well. I saw a photo of you online in an event, I think, and you looked strong. Like someone I wish I had gotten to know better. That's all. Take care. Mom." I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the back of a notebook I kept in my desk drawer, one filled with pages of reflections I'd written throughout the past 2 years. It wasn't an apology in the traditional sense. There were no grand acknowledgments, no details of what they did wrong. But there was something quieter in its tone, a hesitation I had never heard in her voice before, as if for the first time she realized she wasn't entitled to my forgiveness. That in itself was a shift. I didn't reply. Not because I was angry, but because I no longer felt compelled to mend things that had only ever served to wound me. The truth was, I had built a full life without their presence, a life in which I didn't flinch when I walked into rooms or shrink in conversations, a life where my name meant something not because someone else gave it value, but because I had chosen to. In the months that followed, I grew bolder. Solace, Creative expanded to a second office in Austin. I was invited to speak at a design leadership conference in Seattle. I even agreed to be interviewed for a podcast focused on female founders who came from difficult backgrounds. The host asked me a question near the end that made me pause. "What would you tell your younger self?" she asked. I thought for a long moment, then said, "That it's okay to walk away. That silence doesn't mean you're wrong, it just means you're done explaining yourself to people who never planned to understand." After the episode aired, my inbox filled with messages from strangers, some thanking me, others sharing their own stories of families that had silenced them, dismissed them, pushed them into boxes that never fit. One message stood out. It was from a young woman in Ohio who wrote, "I listened to you today while sketching a logo for a nonprofit I want to start. My mom always told me I'd never be more than average. Hearing you speak reminded me that being underestimated isn't a curse, it's fuel. Thank you for sharing your fire." I cried after reading that. Not because I was sad, but because I finally understood that the story I had fought to rewrite for myself had begun to light the way for others. That was legacy. Not the money, not the house, not even the company, but the ripple effect of reclaiming my voice, of refusing to be small. That weekend, I returned to Grandpa's house. I hadn't lived there in a while, but I kept it maintained, used it for team retreats or quiet getaways when the city felt too loud. I sat on the porch swing with a blanket around my shoulders and watched the rain fall against the garden he had once tended with such care. I thought of all the nights I had sat beside him as a scared, uncertain girl, and how I'd slowly become a woman he would have recognized not just by blood, but by strength. The wind picked up, and the chimes in the eaves began to sing. I closed my eyes, leaned back, and listened. For the first time in my life, the silence was not empty. It was whole. It was mine. Months passed, and the seasons shifted again, the air turning crisp with the arrival of fall. I spent my days balancing client calls with design reviews and strategy sessions, but in the quieter moments, those early mornings when the city hadn't quite stirred, or the late nights when the world softened, I found myself reflecting on how far I'd come. The life I had now was quiet in the best way. I no longer woke with dread, no longer edited myself to fit into rooms I was never meant to shrink for. And though I didn't seek validation anymore, it still surprised me when it arrived in unexpected places. One afternoon, I received an invitation to speak at a private business summit hosted by a National Women's Leadership Council. I was listed as a featured keynote speaker alongside CEOs, founders, and innovators I had admired from a distance for years. At first, I thought they'd confused me with someone else. But no, they had read my article, followed Solace Creative's growth, and wanted my perspective on resilience branding and forging identity beyond inherited narratives. I accepted. The event was held in San Francisco at a rooftop venue overlooking the bay. As I stepped onto the stage in front of a sea of faces, many older, wealthier, and more experienced than me, I didn't feel intimidated. I felt ready. I wasn't born into a legacy I began, I inherited silence, and I chose to turn it into a voice. The room stilled. I spoke about the myth of family loyalty, about the cost of staying where you are not seen, and about the quiet, grueling work of rebuilding from nothing but belief in yourself. I shared the story of the will, reading how my sister handed me $2 with a smirk, how my grandfather's real letter turned everything upside down, and how I used that moment not as revenge, but as rebirth. When I finished, the applause didn't just sound polite, it felt alive. Women came up to me afterward with tears in their eyes. One said, "You just told my story in a way I didn't know I needed to hear." Another whispered, "I left my family last year. I haven't looked back, but I felt so guilty. You made me feel strong again." I flew home with a strange sense of weightlessness, as if I had shed the last remnants of the need to prove anything. That night, I received a text from an unknown number. It was Melissa. Just 3 words. "You were incredible." I stared at it for a long time, then typed back, "Thank you." I didn't say more. I didn't invite connection. I didn't reopen old wounds, but I acknowledged it. That felt like enough. A few weeks later, I visited Grandpa's grave for the first time since the funeral. I had stayed away for many reasons, grief, anger, avoidance, but now it felt like time. I brought a single sunflower, his favorite, and knelt by the stone. "You were right," I whispered. "They tried to keep me small, but you gave me a way out, and I took it." I sat with him in silence, the kind that used to terrify me, but now offered a strange comfort. I told him about the company, the summit, the house. I told him I was happy, that I finally knew what peace felt like. As I stood to leave, I placed the sunflower gently at the base of the headstone and smiled. "Thank you for believing in me when I didn't know how to believe in myself." On the way home, I passed the old neighborhood. The house my parents still lived in sat just as it had for years, neat, cold, unchanging. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. My story no longer lived there. It lived in every logo my firm created, in every young designer I mentored, in every word I spoke at conferences, in every time someone read my story and whispered to themselves, "I can do that too." One night, as I wrapped up a virtual workshop with a group of first-generation college students, one of the young women lingered after the call. Her name was Ruby, and she had a quiet, fiery kind of presence. She asked, "Do you ever wish you could go back and change the past?" I thought for a long moment, then said, "Sometimes. But then I remember I wouldn't be here if it hadn't happened that way." She nodded slowly. "So the pain was worth it?" "No," I said. "But the freedom I found afterward was." As I ended the call and shut my laptop, I caught my reflection in the dark screen. I saw not a girl desperate to be seen, but a woman who had become undeniable. A woman whose story began in silence, but would never end there. Winter arrived with quiet dignity blanketing the city in soft gray light and urging people indoors to slower rhythms and warmer spaces. I spent more evenings at home curled up with a book or sketching ideas by the fireplace wrapped in a calm I had never known in my earlier years. It was in this season of stillness that a final invitation arrived, one I hadn't expected and would have once feared. It was from the board of a philanthropic art foundation asking if I would consider joining as a creative director and strategic advisor. The board, composed of influential voices in design education and cultural preservation, had followed Solace Creative's impact work and believed I could help shape their future direction. The foundation's mission aligned with everything I'd grown to believe in amplifying underrepresented artists, supporting visual storytelling from marginalized communities, and funding mentorships for young creators. I said yes, not to impress anyone, not to prove anything, but because it felt like the natural evolution of what I had been building quietly, deliberately, on my own terms. My first meeting with the board took place in a historic converted warehouse filled with local murals, student art, and sculptures made of recycled materials. As I stepped into the room, a few people stood and clapped lightly, not for show but in recognition. I took my seat, looked around, and realized something profound: this room wasn't built for me, but I had earned my place in it anyway. One evening, after a full day of planning a citywide youth art initiative, I received a handwritten package in the mail. Inside was a sketch pad, old and weathered, with my name embossed on the corner. The note that accompanied it was from one of Grandpa's old colleagues who had found the pad while clearing out a storage unit from a closed-down community center. "Your grandfather used to bring this with him," the note said. Said it was for someone who hadn't yet found her line. I flipped through the pages and saw it: his sketches, his handwriting, his quiet hopes traced in ink and charcoal. And then, nestled between pages of concept drafts, a folded paper I had never seen before. It was a letter addressed to my future artist. It was undated, but unmistakably his. I unfolded it with trembling hands. If you're reading this, then you've found your way to the page. I hope you've built a life full of bold strokes, vibrant color, and spaces where your truth has room to stretch. I hope you didn't let the gray walls of others contain you. You were never meant to be quiet. You were meant to be clear. I believe in the world you're shaping. Keep drawing. Keep building. Keep being the story they never saw coming. I pressed the letter to my chest and closed my eyes, overwhelmed not by sadness, but by a fullness I couldn't name. He had left me this not because he feared I'd fail, but because he knew I would one day become someone who needed a final push to keep daring even after the storm had passed. That weekend, I hosted an art showcase for emerging teen artists in a space Solace Creative helped renovate. The room was filled with canvases splashed in color and stories scrawled on walls in vivid expression. One of the girls, maybe 16, walked up to me with wide eyes and asked, "Are you the founder?" I smiled. "Yes." "Did you really start from nothing?" "Worse than nothing," I said gently. "I started with people who wanted me invisible." She looked at the mural behind me, one that read in bold letters, "Your voice belongs here." "But you made it," she whispered. I looked around the room at the art, the laughter, the possibility. "Yes, and so will you." That night, I stood alone in the middle of the exhibit once everyone had left. I stared at the mural one last time. It had been painted by a girl who barely spoke during orientation, but had poured her entire soul into the colors she chose. It was fierce, unapologetic, and alive. I touched the wall gently as if to anchor myself to the moment. And in that quiet, I finally understood the real twist in my story. It wasn't that I had survived the will reading, the betrayal, the isolation. It was that I had turned $2 and a forgotten letter into an empire of voice. I walked out of the studio that night under a moonlit sky, feeling the snow beginning to fall, each flake catching the streetlight like a blessing. My story had begun in silence, but it would echo for generations.